Welcome to the FMCG guys. Daniel Torres speaking and joined by Efrain Rosario. How are you?
Good, Daniel. Good to be with you.
Excellent. And welcome to part 2 of the episode with Oliver Baggaley, the director from Ahold. You hopefully heard to part 1, where we talked about different aspects of omnichannel and especially digital retail, the relationship with FMCG brands, supply chain, etc. And as announced, here we are with part 2, where we're going to have a deep dive at the business model of direct-to-consumer customer value proposition and how to balance that with profitability, especially now at a time where investors seem to be looking more at profitability than growth.
So to that point, I was going to say, I love your example about the triangle in terms of talking about the brand, the retailer, and the consumer. So I would love to get your perspective on the third part or the third point in that triangle, which is around the consumer, and understanding a little bit, getting your perspective in regards to how the value proposition has changed to consumers, both during COVID, but now, as you said, post-COVID, as we now move into a time where economic uncertainty is becoming a greater concern. How have you seen that evolution over the past years?
Sorry, and if I may add as well, I think that, and going a bit back to the FMCG companies, like what's the value proposition of a retailer like Ahold versus direct-to-consumer alternatives, for example? Like what's for the consumer and also for the brands, what's the value proposition?
Yeah, maybe just to tackle that latter question first, and then we can shift into how the customer value proposition has changed over COVID. I think for the FMCG player, the biggest value proposition retailers like Ahold Delhaize can offer is having that really strong relationship with our customers. And if you're a big FMCG player, you might say, and it might well be true, you've got an equally strong relationship, but that is the minority, the significant minority. But B, I think there's the risk that as an FMCG player, you're not necessarily seeing those broader trends if you were just doing direct to consumer that we as a retailer will see and can help shape. So to pick a couple of examples, I think when consumers are coming into a large shop with tens of thousands of different SKUs, they're given a huge amount of choice, including new challenger brands in different categories or even slight tweaks on existing categories. And we are able, going back to that data point, able to share with FMCG companies, where are we seeing the growth? Where are we seeing the opportunities that you could tap into, either through organic moves into those space or acquisition? So I think we are just closer to the customer. And also an FMCG player might be focused on a few categories. We're looking at that broader customer mission of, what am I going to eat? And I think that's the real connection. I'm not saying it will never change, but I think at the moment that's our real benefits.
I would just add that I think that the magic happens when you combine, like you said, that proximity to the customer at the moment of choice that retailers can bring with the depth of understanding the motivations and the desires of consumers that I think the good FMCGs, a lot of the category leaders can bring.
Yeah.
And I love your point around being able to look beyond just your category and understanding what does this mean in the grand scheme of things in terms of how consumers shop, period, not just for your category, but shop for a certain mission or for a stock up trip. I think that that interplay across categories is always super interesting as well.
Which I think segues nicely into COVID and changing value proposition and what consumers were looking for. I suppose that the biggest thing to start with is where, if we just focus on food, consumers had a significant shift from out-of-home consumption to in-home consumption because restaurants just weren't open, or you weren't going to work and therefore you weren't eating at the office or eating at the food establishment nearby. And we saw it go from less than 50% of food value being consumed at home to around 55%. And while that has started to move back, we're still seeing an elevated amount of food at home consumption. I think for a couple of reasons. One is changing consumer habits. So partly that shift to at home consumption, and this is more anecdotal. I think we'd need to really see the data in the coming years. But consumers have got used to that. They've got used to more online shopping that makes that process easier. They've got used to cooking at home more. They've enjoyed that. And so I think that has remained. And then the bigger driver, well, that's my opinion, but I think a bigger driver as well is inflation. So although we've seen food inflation actually be higher for at-home consumption versus restaurants, interestingly, because they are still more expensive, if consumers are really focused on value, which we'll come to in a moment, that's an advantage for the retailers, for the supermarkets who can give you cheaper food than a restaurant.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Ollie.
I was just going to say before we jump into value, 'cause that's more of the last 6 months. I think the big thing over COVID was restaurants are shut. Consumers are worried about safety. Some consumers didn't want to leave the house. How can we get our food? And we saw really interesting transformation of our internal capabilities to be able to do that, which varied by region. So in places like the Netherlands, where we already had a really strong online grocery proposition, we just ramped that up. More sales shifted through there, but fundamentally the operations didn't change. Maybe we had to ramp up faster, get more delivery drivers, but that was just accelerating existing plans. In places like the US, it was really interesting where pre-COVID penetration was low single digits of grocery spend. I'd say quite a lot of skepticism in the industry. Could the amount of e-com sales compared to total in grocery reach the same levels of Europe? And as a result, there hadn't been those big investments in, say, fulfillment capability, like big centralized fulfillment warehouses. So, in fact, what we saw more of in the US was working with partners, people like Instacart, not necessarily with Ahold Delhaize, but people like DoorDash. In Europe, we have equivalents like Deliveroo, Just Eat Takeaway, working with these partners to provide that picking and last mile capability so we can leverage our store network, but then also get food from those stores to customers' homes, leveraging partners' capabilities. So we've seen that huge growth. It was over 35% online growth between 2020 and 2021. So we now do around 10 billion euros of sales through online globally, from over $80 billion or 80 billion euro business. Same thing at the moment. So it's now a significant part of the business. And while we do expect it to tail off slightly from the COVID peaks, we don't think it's returning to pre-COVID levels. We'll continue to see that elevated point. And I'll pause in a sec, but the other topic within that we can talk about is delivery speed. So a subsection of that e-commerce transformation. We've then seen the challengers pop up who are offering grocery delivery in 15 minutes. Yeah. But I'll pause there.
Well, I was going to say, to that last point, Ollie, you know this from living in Amsterdam. If you're living anywhere in town, you can't go more than a block without seeing new entrants. Which comes with, there is some consumer benefit, but there's also drawbacks to it as well. Which we'll save that discussion for another time. But I thought it was interesting that you talked about how you said that the internal capabilities that were in essence built during COVID varied by market. How have you seen some of that continue, or what's been the evolution of that in terms of like for AD for Ahold Delhaize as well? Like, have you seen, for example, that some of the learnings that you all had in the US around like these fulfillment partners, how has that evolved and perhaps maybe even carried over across markets?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we're in a very unique position having this global footprint where not everything translates across continents. Like sourcing still tends to be relatively regional or national, but there are some key benefits where we can learn from trends that are maybe happening at a slightly different pace in different markets and bring them across. So to that example, we've definitely leveraged our learnings of working with Instacart in the US across to Europe, everything from how you set up the operations to contract negotiations to making sure that the consumer has a good experience and it doesn't feel too disparate if you're shopping through a partner versus our own platform. And actually, we leverage some of those learnings to launch a partnership collaboration in the Netherlands. So Albert Heijn is now working with Just Eat Takeaway, so their local brand Thuisbezorgd, and Deliveroo to offer deliveries within an hour from some of our stores. And the discussions with them were significantly accelerated using our understanding of best practice from the US. And just touching quickly on that delivery speed point, we think the 15-minute delivery, while yes, being beneficial to some customers, I think is a relatively niche proposition. And actually what we see as really valuable is being able to offer 30 to 60-minute delivery, which really appeals to customers who have maybe forgotten a couple of items for dinner, or they've got friends around and want a restock of certain items. And being able to do that without the customers needing to leave their home is incredibly valuable. Do you need it in 15 minutes? You can't even get a takeaway in 15 minutes, or at least maybe some pizza chains will give you that, but it's not standard. So I think we've found a middle ground that we think is a great offer for the consumers, but also allows us and our partners to do it in a sustainable way.
Yeah. And actually, to this point, like all these Q-commerce players, like they were growing a lot on the basis of like future growth. So it was all based on growth. But I think that now in the last few weeks, especially, and it's funny, Oli, because we met in Shop Talk in June, and now we're in September, and this has only increased a lot, like the focus of from growth to profitability. So how do you build a great value proposition, not based on growth, but on profitability? Like how can you get these two together?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we have to grapple with now that e-commerce is a significant part of the business. 10 years ago, it was a drop in the ocean, and most retail leaders didn't think it was going to become much. So we can have it loss-making. We don't need to overly focus on it. Whereas now, if you don't get e-commerce right, you're going to start losing money. So we look at 4 drivers to balance e-commerce profitability and making sure the customer's getting what they're after. So I think the first is sales density and scale, and that links in with the omni-channel point. So can we make sure that we are operating in areas where we have enough customer demand to make sure that our picking operations, our last mile operations, the supply chain operations that connect them, we can do that at scale and therefore a low cost. And I think one big advantage we have versus pure players is that we can leverage this store network, particularly with the demand for instant delivery, even if it's not quick commerce of 15 minutes, even if it's within the hour, being able to efficiently pick from a store and deliver using a last mile local network is a huge advantage versus the likes of Ocado, who only have, they are experimenting with other things like Ocado Zoom, but traditionally have had the big centralized fulfillment centers that focus on next day delivery. So the first is that density and scale. The second is, can we match the local demands of the customer and make sure that it's at least at par and ideally better than our local competitors. And what I mean by that is there's not a one-size-fits-all for all our markets. I mentioned at the start we have 19 great local brands, which means what we do in the Czech Republic or Romania will be very different from what we do in the US. And in the US, Instacart's very popular, so we go with that, and we have a partnership model. In places like Romania, we're pushing more of the e-commerce through our own platform and maybe leveraging partners for that white label last mile solution, but it's through our own platform. So there's different things we need to do to appeal to the customers, and some markets may prefer better deals over speed, as another example. I think that the third bucket is making sure we're laser focused on being operationally efficient, and I'd say this is a big difference with the Q-commerce players. They're different business models. If you're being funded by VC who wants fast growth, market domination, fine. Our investors are looking at us as a traditional retailer. We think we can add value by also innovating in places, but ultimately we keep a laser focus on that margin. And to do that, we have to optimize our operations. And really that's around fulfillment and last mile. So we've mentioned, say, partnerships using our store network, but we're also looking at can we have more mechanized solutions in our big fulfillment centers to reduce our cost there. So using that approach of Ocado I just mentioned, but having a hybrid approach where you have some of that can do your next day and maybe later same day delivery, supplemented by your store network that can do the more immediate shopping solutions. And then the last one, we've also touched on this, but we see data and insights plus media, retail media, as a key part of e-com to help make the channel profitable. And the reason why I think it's predominantly an e-com point rather than broader omni-channel is that we're seeing the real interest from FMCG players because of those digital touch points. So because the consumer can come on our website and we are seeing what are they looking at, what are they placing in the basket, maybe what are they swapping out of a basket, what are they then doing when they go in store later. That growth of e-com has enabled that really rich omni-channel view. And I think at the moment we're only scratching the surface on the kind of opportunities we can provide both to customers in terms of giving them really relevant and valuable offers and communications, but also for us and the FMCG players.
Yeah. This has been great, Ollie. I mean, I've got a copious amount of notes just for my own learning in terms of what you shared today. So I'm sure our audience has taken a lot away from it as well. So first off, thank you for sharing all that and giving us insight into the mind of a digitally savvy retailer. To wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask you a question that we ask all of our guests, and it in essence helps share some of the learnings you've had from a leadership standpoint with our audience as well. So what advice would you give your younger self, given the wealth of experience that you've had, not just at Ahold Delhaize, but at places like Ocado and Bain and the other stops along your career?
Yeah, I mean, very interesting question and lots of different directions we could go. I think the one I'd pick out is be open to opportunities and do that by talking to as many people as possible. So I suppose I'm practicing what I'm preaching by being on this podcast, and if anyone's listening to it, feel free to reach out. Would love to connect. But I've found over my career being open to just have those interesting conversations, connect with people, help where you can. You never know what opportunities it might lead to in the future, either through some kind of collaboration from your own business perspective, maybe a future job opportunity, or maybe just sharing a really interesting insight that you weren't aware of because you don't see that side of the problem. So more and more, I've just embraced being involved, being in the ecosystem and trying to learn from as many people as possible.
This was Oliver Baggaley from Ahold. Very interesting. Glad we had the extra time with him, and thanks to Ollie as well for dedicating that extra time to us. Ephraim, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, thanks to Ollie for being so generous with his time and his insight. Always interesting to get the perspective, particularly, like you said, from the retailer point of view. In this part too, I thought super interesting to hear him talk about the partnerships that Ahold Delhaize has entered into with delivery platforms like Just Eat and Deliveroo, and how that compares to some of the new entrants from a quick commerce standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's going to be interesting to see in the coming years as well how Q-commerce can actually fight, and it seems like a contradiction, but fight against retail really ramping up on capabilities, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a company like Ahold Delhaize, as Ali referenced, one of the things that they have working to their advantage is being able to borrow best practices from across their markets. So he referenced being able to take some of the learnings they had from operating in the US during the COVID pandemic, and being able to then leverage those as they rolled out their partnerships with people like Just Eat and Deliveroo.
Yeah, exactly. Any other remarks that you would take in terms of also profitability and customer, and also customer value proposition? I think that was very interesting. Also of why FMCG companies should be on the likes of Ahold Delhaize's websites.
Well, I think it's, as we talked about with Ollie, you're going to have, there's not going to be one single channel that you, as either a retailer or an FMCG brand, are going to focus on exclusively. I think consumers have, general, and the retail industry in general has evolved way past that point. I really like Ollie's reference to the triangle model, where you think about the retailer, the brand, and the consumer as the three elements within that model, and thinking about how do you deliver value so that it's relevant to all three of those. So from a profitability standpoint, I loved Ollie's perspective in regards to the 4 drivers that they've identified within Ahold Delhaize around sales density, being able to match or meet local demand, thinking about operational efficiency. And I think, as you referenced, particularly now as investors are starting to focus more on profitability as opposed to just growth, super important. And then lastly, the role of data and insights. And it's comforting to hear that Ollie referenced, we're just scratching the surface in regards to the potential that can deliver both to retailers, but also to FMCG brands as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. Well, this was super interesting. It was great to have somebody, I think, from the retailer side as well. Hope to have more of them coming in the future, because you just hear a whole different reality. So for me, it was a great learning. Hope for you as well, audience, it was a great learning. I hope you enjoyed also the double episode, which is the first time that we actually do it. We'll probably have later in this year some repeat guests, which we'll unveil soon. But yeah, hope you enjoyed it. A shout out also to our friends, the CPG guys. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn. If you're not following us yet, it's a great way for you to support us. As you know, all the content we do is for free. So if you can follow us on LinkedIn, and even more so, come with us with suggestions. Even if you want to criticize us, that's more than welcome.
It's constructive feedback is always welcome. So yeah, definitely let us know your thoughts, good, better, indifferent. And share with us suggestions for future episodes as well.